Hello. Welcome to the BSides Canberra panel. So the idea of this panel is that it's really interactive, so I want you guys to have your hands up the entire time asking our panelists questions. You'll get a list of the topics that we're asking in the booklet and online as well. The idea is that this is, quite lively and quite interactive, so please do get involved. We have 5 great panelists today, and I'll get each one of them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do. So on the left, we have Metal. Did you want to...
Well, hello there. You might remember me from such cons as KiwiCon, also a risky business. Also, I guess I'm a hacker and stuff. I have a beard. Apparently I'm old. That's a joke now. I didn't know that, but apparently I am. Thanks very much, everybody. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I've just been doing this around here for a while, and apparently that makes me authoritative for some reason.
Let's thank Metal. Next up, we have Peter Gutman. You might have remembered Peter Gutman from our keynote earlier today.
So I'm technically with the University of Auckland, but I work more in industry than academia, which means I get to throw rocks at academics and at the industry, depending on which hat I'm wearing. And I have an interest in cryptography and high assurance systems.
Let's welcome Pete. Next up, we have Jess.
I'm IT girl with a GR, also Jessica. I work in ACT government. Standard disclaimer applies. This is just me saying I reckon, and I'm in no way speaking on behalf of the ACT government. I work in the governance, compliance and risk area, which has been recently more excitingly renamed the cyber strategy and governance team, so that people will turn up to the meetings. So that's my perspective.
And let's welcome Jess. And next up, Liam, another great beard in the panelists.
Hi, my name's Liam, or Liamasaur on Twitter. I'm a pen tester, and I'm the director of consulting at Assurance.
Let's welcome Liam. And last up, Joe.
I'm Joe Fitzpatrick, or Securely Fits on Twitter. I'm a hardware hacker. I teach classes on hardware hacking and talk about it a lot. So, yeah.
Joe was also our keynote yesterday, so let's welcome Joe and all the panelists.
Silvio, can we get a little bit more foldback for the...
What's that, sorry?
A bit more foldback, if that's possible.
A handheld mic?
No, just a bit more foldback from the audio.
We can't hear each other.
We can't hear what we're saying.
Oh, okay.
Maybe that's a good thing.
That way we can't
There's
just say,
looks of confusion on my face right now. We'll just make do. It is a bit difficult to hear up here, but hopefully we'll get through this. So the first question that I want to ask the panelists, and this is probably something that is sort of fairly personal to me as well. And we haven't listed this question on the website in the booklet. It's sort of, we had this idea afterwards, and it's a pretty simple question.
Your shoes look lovely, if that's what the question is.
Thank you. So, okay, so why are techies paid less than their managers? Now, Metal, you've worked as a techie. And I'm sure you've done many other jobs. In your experience, let's just all establish for a start, do techies get paid less than their managers? Instead of why do techies get paid less than the managers? In your experience working with technical staff, do they get paid less than the people above them that aren't necessarily technical but are managing them?
Not where I work, but that's probably because I'm also the manager, so... But no, well, I don't know, it's a good question. I haven't worked in a real organisation. I've only ever worked for a group of hackers, and we pay each other pretty well, I hope, and we have no managers, so...
Do you think that's reflective of industry, though? Do you think that techies in general are paid well compared to management?
Well, I think so, but yeah, I know, I guess we attack regular organisations from the outside, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask about regular corporate structure because, well...
Well, let's ask Joe. Joe, you've worked at Intel, and I don't want to target Intel specifically, even though I've just said that name. You've worked in a corporate environment. Is it reflective of industry that managers do get paid more than the technical staff?
Well, the technical staff their job is to solve technical problems. The management staff is to let the company make money, right? In my experience, a really good manager can actually amplify and enable their technical contributors to do a whole lot more. A good manager of 10 people can have 10 times the impact of an excellent individual contributor. So there is some argument for that. At the same time, that's the excellent managers. That's the very 2 sigma top managers. This is not the bell curve, the middle 68% or below, which I have experience with the whole range of.
Well, Metal, how does that make you feel? Do you think that you had managers when you were in hacker companies that were enabling you to perform pen tests to the best of the company's ability, and that the management was driving the funds as opposed to the techies actually doing the pen tests?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think back to the last people that managed me that wasn't Brett Moore, so I have to be careful about what I say.
Brett's great, by the way. So.
Brett's a great person, but he's also a hell of a manager. I guess I'm really lucky in that I've only ever worked for people who are better hackers than me, namely Brett fucking Moore, right? If anyone else who knows that guy, that guy can hack. And so, yeah, I always felt that he pushed me to do way more than I would have done, and as a result, probably deserves getting more money than me, which he does, by the way, if he's watching. I don't know if he is, but...
Peter, what do you think? You've worked in university environments. You're obviously aware that heads of schools and general managers, probably are on a high scale than a senior lecturer, even an associate professor maybe. Do you think that is reflective of what the core business of a university is? Do you think that the senior leadership of a university should be paid more?
So I'm affiliated with the university, but I don't work there. And like Metal, I may be the wrong person to ask because I've always been self-employed, so I get paid the same as my manager. However, comment on that, I know that some organisations like IBM and Sun and so on have the concept of something like a research scientist or distinguished scientist or something like that. So they recognise that they've got a technically very talented person, but if they then remove their brain and call them a manager, then that's not a good use of those resources. So they have these sort of parallel advancement paths where they call them something like a distinguished scientist or chief scientist or whatever. So they get paid the same as a manager, a senior manager, and they have the same clout as a senior manager without necessarily being a manager. So there are ways of getting around that. For some reason, I think only large corporations do that. I don't know of small businesses that do that sort of thing.
Do we have anyone in the audience that has a view on this? A techie or a manager? No one wants to put up... Oh, we've got a question over here. Oh, we've got a comment over here.
Cheers. I've jumped around a bit in the industry, and I think you do get variations of it, right? I've had the experience of both being a manager of teams of up to 12 or more, and then I've actually jumped out of that into being technical specialist roles in big corporate environments where you can actually make more than you can as middle management. Obviously, middle management are often targets of hostility because maybe they're not the 2 Sigma bent, but fundamentally, I think that answer was spot on, that managers can, at the end of the day, make sure the team is able to steer a greater amount of change than is possible as an individual contributor. On the other hand, as a very good individual contributor, you can have that some places recognise that and have specific specialist roles that are actually pretty well paid, even in many corporate environments.
We've got a question, comment over here as well.
Yeah, I think it's important, like from where I've come from in my team. Yes, I'm very technical, but at the end of the day, I can down tools, go home and go to bed, and not look at my phone, not get hassled by executives, whereas my boss goes home and stays awake for 4 hours stressing about stuff like that. So I think it's just kind of, yes, I might have more technical skills than him, but I guess less responsibility, maybe, I think is kind of, that's what I've found in my sort of working with with management like that is, I guess I can just leave, and he gets to stay awake at night.
You're not the one that gets fired when they're trying Chinese ruin your shit. Managers get paid more because if your network gets ruined by the Chinese, they're the ones that get sacked.
Seems fair.
Well, I don't know if that's entirely true, to be honest, because if you look at all the charges that the US is making against Chinese state-sponsored hackers, they're actually putting criminal charges against particular operators of computers. They're not charging the president or the prime minister of China. They're charging the guy that probably doesn't know what tool he's using. He's just typing on a keyboard. Is that a reasonable comment? Okay, next comment.
I think this is a sort of a question obscured by the fact that pretty much industry, government, everywhere standard is salary opacity. No one knows what I'm earning. No one earns. I don't know what anyone else in my team is earning. So how do I know whether my manager is earning more than me? He's not going to say. Yeah. What do you think about pay transparency?
Well, if you go and work in government, you know exactly what people earn because there's very prescribed pay bands, and the jobs are gazetted, and you know exactly. Like, anyone can see my classification. They know the band that I'm earning. Same with my manager and their manager. So, I'm in the fortunate position that, and I think a lot of us are in this room, where we are well paid in this country for what we do, for the most part, hopefully, in the nicest possible way, I don't care so much about the money as the work, and I recognise an incredibly privileged position to be in. But I think it works well in government. People know what the bands are. The only downside of that is you get a little bit of not my pay grade kind of stuff. But I think for the most part, the people that I've seen working in government are very focused on doing the best they possibly can and getting it done, and often just as under-resourced or worse than the private sector.
And at least we've got a question about hacking here. Like, if you want to know what someone else gets paid, like, that's the thing we're equipped to answer. That's an engineering problem, right? Go ask the SAP system and, job done.
Look, just to go back to what Jess was talking about, I don't work for government. I never have. But if you look at the pay grades that are offered, there are actual hard limits for technical roles. And beyond a certain pay scale or grade, you have to move into management. Do we believe by that statement that management is the natural progression? Once a techie gets too good, they naturally move into management and they forget about their technical abilities. Is there a limit to being technical? Because if you look at the pay grades, it implies that.
I might take that one a little bit. I think we really do both technicians and management a disservice. And I noticed also you kind of changed the terms of reference there a little bit earlier. We started talking about managers, then we started talking about leadership. And there's often two very different things. We often have a lot of really good managers and we have very few good leaders. And I think when you're fortunate enough to have a good leader in your team, then you get that force multiplier effect that Joe, I think you were talking about. I think it's a real problem when you have people whose skill set and passion and capability is in technical areas, and for reasons of money or prestige or whatever, the only pathway within an organisation is into management. I think organisations need to find different pathways, like the research side of things you were talking about, because often, I've worked with some brilliant technical people who were terrible managers and maybe shouldn't have been running and there can sometimes be a little bit of arrogance around that. I'm a really smart person, I can do all this amazing stuff, how hard can running a business be? I'll just do that, rather than saying, I'm great at this, maybe I'll go and pay someone to manage this, or I'll hire someone who has that skill set. And for the really good managers, there is actually a lot of skill involved. It's not just a bunch of people who can say glib stuff and talk to people. There's actual skill involved, and I think it's a bit dismissive to suggest that it's an easy job. And we don't do ourselves a good service when we talk about hard skills versus soft skills. And I saw somebody on Twitter, I wish I could remember who to credit them, recently talking about technical skills versus professional skills, and I think that's a really good way to look at it.
I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. Do we think that a technical EL1 or a technical EL2 is as smart as you could get technically?
So,
Can you, sorry, Silvio, can you translate that out of Canberran to English?
I've been in Canberra too long. So,
Thanks, Liam.
so again, I don't work for government, but I do know about the grades. And so in the federal, and I'm probably the worst person to talk about this because obviously I don't, you know. So there's the APS, the Australian Public Service payment system and pay grades. And you have APS levels up to 6. And once you go beyond the APS level 6, you go into the executive level, which is 1 to 2. And then beyond that, you start to get into the senior executive level. And as far as I'm aware, the maximum APS level for a technical person in Australia is an EL1 and an EL2. And it's actually very hard to get those roles as a technical person. And the natural progression, once you reach that point, is to move into management. And there's, you know, once you get beyond that, there's the only way to get a pay rise really in the APS is to become a manager. I've got some shaking heads here, so I'll hand it over.
I left the Commonwealth. The reason most technical people leave is that exact pay problem. You can become a consultant or a contractor and in some cases go back to a very similar role and get paid more than your manager was. And that's a result of the Commonwealth's decisions about 20 years ago to scrap the idea of having a different classification for skilled technical people in computing and push them all into the EL1. So it's just and then they outsourced everything as well, so.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? I think the contracting route is really an attractive thing for many people.
Cool. I am lucky enough to work for a startup. We don't have managers. I've been given autonomy. I quite like it. But it's also this mix of like, as companies scale, that might not work. But at the moment, I don't need one. And I really appreciate being put in that position. And I get paid well enough. So I guess if you kill the managers, money trickles down. Reaganomics works.
And a question over there.
Hello. So I'm new to the whole industry, but I've found that it's not exactly, it's what you count as valuable. So to me, making $1 million a week doesn't interest me. It's just being able to learn. And I found in my new job role that I'm learning things that I never could online.
I think that looking at that, like looking at what a company values is pretty indicative. If you go to a website of a company that is a security company and you look at about the company, do you see salespeople and executives, or do you see technical people who make technical contributions? If you work at a big corporation, even one that has, thanks. If you work at a company, even one that has a technical path, so Intel has a technical path all the way up to grade 12, and they have a managerial path all the way up to grade 12. When you look every year, how many new VPs are there and how many new fellows are there? And I think it's a real indicator of what the company values to see, oh, these decades we had more fellows than we had VPs, but in the past 10 years, we now have 8 times more VPs every year than we have fellows. That really tells you where things are valued, and that's where I go on the assumption that, yeah, management is paid more than technical contributors because it's valued more in some companies, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I think we're sort of maybe dancing around 2 different definitions of management. I mean, like, if you're thinking of a manager as, you know, someone who approves leave and, you know, does shifts and that sort of thing, then sure, anyone can do this. But I think in a highly functioning organisation, what you want from management is for them to be providing strategic direction, which generally workers on the coalface, no matter how good they are, it's extremely difficult for that sort of worker to provide that sort of strategic direction. And that's why you would have that sort of progression from a technical person to a strategic leader because they can draw on their background of technical expertise to be able to provide that sort of direction from the company. And I think that's missing in a lot of organisations, and I think the public service is sort of a great example of that as well.
There's also a difference, I guess, between actually being a manager and being called a manager. So I know some organisations where they've got technical people where they realised that they were technically very good, they would probably make terrible managers. However, in order to give them more money, they would have to call them managers. So they just called them managers. They're still technical people. It's just their title is manager, and so they get paid at the managerial level.
And I think in addition here is there's also things like industry loadings, or like in terms of different pay scales, I think with government and APS levels as well. So I think there is recognition in some parts that technical people do have industry skills. So it is, yeah. So I probably am a bit, sort of probing you guys to sort of, so there are definitely pathways for reasonably competitive rates as well.
Does anyone else think that Silvio's angling for a pay rise somewhere?
Yeah, look, it does vary a little bit by directorate, or like department to department in federal government. In ACT government, it applies across the organisation. Outside of like my current experience, I've known people who were technical people who were hired at, say, the equivalent of an EL1 level, and as Peter was saying, in no other merit-based competitive process would they be awarded an EL1 position, because the criteria for that include team leadership, management skills, and all of the other stuff that goes along with that. But in recognition that they have to be at least vaguely competitive with the private sector pay scales, they hire technical people as, developers or whatever at those higher levels. So I think you'd see that, which is fine if people want to remain in technical careers. I think if they then want to pivot into something that's more managerial, they might find that they are then not competitive in that area because they're very tech heavy and they haven't bolstered the other skills that are expected along with that. Is
there a natural progression to want to move into that strategic level? I mean, is it everyone's dream to move into strategy? And
I think it's interesting. Like I always say, there's no doubt at all that tech is really hard, right? But people are harder. I don't know if you've met people, but people are harder. And really, in terms of things like IT projects, one of the key critical success factors, if you want to talk about it in those kind of buzzword ways, is getting the people on board. And I think good managers, especially managers who have maybe come up through the organisation, maybe have a long history with the organisation, they have a lot of that institutional knowledge. They have a lot of knowledge about who's who in the zoo and who are the people they can leverage and who they can get on board. And it's that kind of strategic game, not just in terms of aligning with strategic direction of the organisation, but understanding strategically who are the power makers, who are the people who can actually get things done and get things greenlit, and kind of it's that kind of level of game. It's like 3D chess to the checkers that the rest of us are playing, kind of thing.
Thank you. From an organisational perspective, something else to consider is from a discipline perspective, not just technically, but legal people, other accountants even. In an organisation, having the ability to have people progress from a discipline, say technical, into a management position gives the people reporting to them and the organisation people in leadership positions that understand how things actually work in real life. So, being a technical person and reporting to a technical manager, they know what I need to do. They know my day-to-day things. They say, hey, how are these 1, 2, 3s and ABCs? And I can say, yes, they're this or that or the other, and you actually understand. And so having in some ways that pay disparity and encouraging people to move up can actually be positive overall for the organisation, because it brings that perspective up into the more senior echelons.
I think you're just rationalising something there, Dick.
I totally am.
Look, I think we might leave it on that topic. It was certainly an interesting topic, but we've got other topics to talk about. Next, I'd like, has everyone heard of the WannaCry ransomware that came out? I think everyone pretty much has. Does someone in our panel want to give us the quick and dirty summary of WannaCry?
So yeah, it was ransomware built on top of the NSA Eternal Blue Windows SMB bug. Remote code exec got released into the wild. It was nominally supposed to crypto people's disks and ask for ransom. It wasn't very good at it. You couldn't actually pay the ransom, so it was no good as ransomware. We couldn't really tell whether it was denial of service in the guise of ransomware or just really incompetent. Went around the world, took out lots of things for people who hadn't patched their Windows XP or otherwise their older Windows boxes. Windows 7 was also vulnerable. It had been patched, like 3 or 4 months before that, after the Eternal Blue got dropped by the shadow brokers. And then it disrupted a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of people lost a lot of money. We saw, was it Maersk's shipping line shut down? We saw, was it DHL, one of the big logistics companies, had a whole bunch of their stuff shut down by it. British National Health Service got taken out by it because they too ran all their hospitals on unpatched Win 7, I guess. And yeah, it was a bad time for a lot of people, but it was also saved by a mysterious hero, and Hero appeared on the internet and found there was a bunch of strings for command and control embedded in the binary. This guy, Marcus Hutchins, Malware Tech on Twitter, looked at one of the strings that was a domain name, realized it wasn't registered, decided to register it, knowing nothing about whether it was going to trigger it or stop it or do nothing. Turned out it stopped it. That worked out well. And as a result, in New Zealand, nothing got WannaCry, thanks to randomly registering domains you find in weird malware on the internet. So lessons to be learned from that, clearly. Yeah, we still don't really know who did it.
How did the US government thank Marcus Hutchins for his
This is a great story. This is terrible.
So he did the dumb thing, which is he went to the US. Yeah, now he's a guest of the federal government. Well, actually, no, maybe he's on bail these days. But he got arrested.
I think he was actually arrested for writing another piece of malware which they thought was attributed to him. So it was actually incidental to WannaCry. But it's still such a strange story that 1 week an internet hero, the next week, behind bars.
Happens to the worst of us.
So is there anything that can be done about WannaCry happening again? I mean, there's so many layers here of almost intrigue and mystery, really. What can be done? Is it Microsoft to blame? Is it the NSA? Is it the shadow brokers? Is it the malware tech guys?
It's a really good question, and I guess the reason it's such a complicated answer is because everything about this is complicated, right? I mean, the pervasive use of technology throughout the society, throughout the world, that relies on, clearly imperfect. We saw that formal validation of even a microkernel is, Australia's greatest achievement, right? So having any sort of security at all is super difficult. We build systems so quickly we can't understand how they work. We don't know what they're going to do when they don't work. And then into that mix we add, geopolitics and spooks and hackers and North Koreans and money and vigilante, warriors on Twitter, and we end up with something where we don't know what's going on. I mean, the fact that WannaCry could happen, the fact that it hadn't happened until now, that we hadn't seen, when was the last time we saw a worm that good, right? Ages. Code Red and Nimda and Slammer and Sassa, whatever the one that took out the IDS product was. That was good times. We haven't seen a worm like that in ages, right? And that's amazing. Why not? That's what I want to know. Why didn't this happen earlier rather than why did it happen? And what would we have done if it was 6 months earlier and it was actually every Windows box on the internet, right? And not just a bunch of unpatched ones in a few countries with a kill switch. Like, what would we do if every box got owned by malware? Like, it would be insane. It'd be crazy town. Linux on the desktop, yeah, amen, brother. Amen. It's truly the year of right now. We're living in it.
Okay, so first of all, I have precisely one Linux on the desktop joke, and I think that Linux on the desktop, the year of that is 2038, but only for 16-bit versions of Linux. So, sorry, 32-bit versions.
It's an apocryphal story.
This trash fire that you were describing. Maybe we can make that better by authorizing corporate hackback laws in the US. Is that a solution?
Code Blue and Code Red, that's such a terrible idea so Code Red was a worm that came out many, many years ago. This was in the early 2000s, I think.
Was it you, Silvio?
It was not me,
Satoshio?
No, but it was one of the responses to Code Red was the idea that let's make a worm that patches all these computers, and that will solve it, because the problem at the time was all of the computers are unpatched. What do they do? You can't contact admins, they won't fix it. What do? Let's just release another worm, the classic hackback. And it was surprising that this actually got, sort of almost mainstream attention in the security industry, as if it was a topic for discussion. Maybe, for me, it seems absolutely crazy, but do you think it's reasonable to have these hackback situations, is that a reasonable option?
Well, I mean, it happened last week, right, with that Cisco Smart Install bug, right, where there was a bug in the Cisco thing, let you auto-configure your switches or whatevs, and some group of American vigilantes went around and like destroyed a bunch of Ciscos in Russia and Iran and stuff, and then patched all of the American ones because USA, which, I mean, on one hand, clearly a terrible idea. On the other hand, well, probably a bunch less American Ciscos got owned because of it. I mean, it's hard to argue with results, even though it's a fucking terrible idea.
So, I mean, it's been pretty widely attributed to North Korea. Do we think that, like, ASD and the NSA aren't hacking back at North Korea?
I guess going back to the code blue, code red discussions that happened, 15 years ago, the argument was that are non-state actors part of the internet, country versus country fighting? Do we have permission to patch people's Windows machines or patch people's old servers if they aren't being taken care of? If the admins aren't looking after them, why can't the
outsource it? Yeah,
because they're not yours.
That's a very good point. Do you think that
Sylvia? I think the answer is people are and people will. The issue is one of should, and the answer is because laws and because potential jail time. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen that are, as you say, if it all works out okay, maybe a blind eye will be turned. But the rule one is don't screw up, or else full force of the law will be brought down on you anyway. So.
Yeah, I wasn't hacking you, I was remotely administering your server, man.
I mean, I think
I was going to say, who was it, Mobile, somebody in Austria, free pen tests from everybody because of one unfortunate customer service rep who, sure, should have done a better job, but, that person was singled out when really that was a training issue and a corporate position and corporate strategy issue. But yeah, it's like, in no way would I ever say, the organisation I work for, yeah, well, maybe we have amazing security. It's like, I don't want that tested out. I mean,
So we're all security.
Sorry, Sylvia, just as a pen tester, I just wanted to respond to, they were not being pen tested, they were being hacked.
Yeah,
Well, we're all security professionals, so we sort of have an understanding of this. But what's the mainstream, interpretation of things like WannaCry? I'm pretty sure that the mainstream interpretation doesn't include words like eternal blue or malware tech, the person, that responded to that. So what is the mainstream interpretation, and how does that relate to what we know as a little bit more informed about what actually happened?
Well, I think probably it's bleep bloop computer stuff. Who knows, right? That's essentially what most people's perspective on this stuff is, and that's pretty fair. They don't have the framework within which to think about, responsible disclosure of bugs or the vulnerabilities, equities management process when you've got a bug like eternal blue. Like those things are really specialized kind of conversations that are beyond the scope of what you can expect to have in general public discourse, I think, right? It's too complicated, and they have to rely on us as an industry to not be a pack of charlatans that make rubbish up and sell boxes that pretend to do securitons when they don't. And we are the ones that are, at fault here. And I don't know that we can expect, reasonable discussion from outside of our industry, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of mainstream, if you mean the general public, and I'll put on my academic hat for a minute, I mean, people have done research into what the unwashed masses, how they perceive viruses and malware. And for them, a virus is just like a biological entity. It's like catching a cold. If they just exist out there, they come from nowhere. Occasionally you catch them, you run an antivirus app and it's gone again, just like taking some medicine, and then you move on. And that's pretty much the understanding of viruses by non-technical people. So yeah, something like WannaCry and Eternal Blue is just, as you say, it's just gobbledygook to them.
Yeah, and there's no, I mean, you see, I don't know how many people have pen tested a thing and gotten caught by antivirus whilst they were doing it. Reasonable show of hands, got snapped by the AV, very, very uncool. And what do after they've snapped you with the AV? Well, they re-image the workstation, job done, right? Because there's no kind of concept, even amongst IT staff, that malware equals person doing bad things to you. Like it's some kind of self-contained entity that arose by itself and disappears when you take the, McAfee Panadol, and it's all fine. And yeah, so tying it back to the fact that there's actually real people, in the case of persistent threatening people, that they are persistent and threatening and are going to keep doing things, like that's lost unfortunately on most people. And we need to think about how we explain that in a way that's meaningful, and maybe the answer is we can't, right? I mean,
Got a question over here.
Not really a question, but so WannaCry was a great way for us to get all our shit patched, right? Like,
yeah, I mean,
it made the news, so it's like, fuck, we better do this thing. We patched all our shit that weekend. It was done, and that was a really great way to get a whole bunch of stuff patched.
I mean, every time
everybody knew about it.
That maybe people died.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in New Zealand, we were, I guess, fortunate that we were ahead of a lot of people in the time zone, so we managed to patch pretty fast. But sure, yeah.
But like, it only has to happen once now. So like, the shadow brokers did warn that they were going to drop these NSC ODAs for SMB before the fact, and then they did drop them, and they were legit ODAs. So really, all we need now is the shadow brokers to say, we've got Telnet ODAs, FTP ODAs, RDP ODAs. And all of a sudden, all these bullshit services that are connected to the internet that shouldn't be will get patched, disappear.
Did you see that there was a RDP remote code exec someone dropped on Twitter this week? That looks pretty sweet.
I'm looking forward to work on Monday.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fun times on Monday. Yeah, we're going to go and pop some shells. Good times, good times.
Got a question or a comment over here?
So we saw the Stuxnet attacks by, let's say, unknown players against the Iranian centrifuges. Then we saw other players attack the Ukrainian power supply. We've seen WannaCry. We've seen NotPetya a year or so ago. My conjecture is that we're on the verge of essentially cyber warfare, open cyber warfare, becoming more mainstream.
Well, I mean, we had the Director of Offensive Cyber Ops for the Australian Government giving the keynote here today. I mean, yesterday, I guess, for this conference, right? If that doesn't say this is a thing that's out there in the front of your national policy, I'm assuming you're Australian, my apologies if you're not, the fact that it's out there, clearly we are in a place where that is a real tool of geopolitics. I mean, obviously we see that with North Korea, and we've seen it with Iran, and we've seen the way that Israel have used their capabilities. Yeah, absolutely, it's a thing that we are on the cusp of. I mean, I don't want to say cyber war because then I have to drink a thing, but yeah, no, clearly we are in that dystopic future already, and the rise of non-nation state actors in that space as well, like as I mentioned a couple of B-sides ago, right, the fact that the cyber is trickling down to individual civilians, and the fact, I mean, going back to the vigilante, hackback, code red, code blue thing, like the fact that that happened at all is down to probably 2 or 3 people, right? One guy maybe did that thing with the Cisco Smart install. We're at the point where it kind of doesn't matter whether anything is a good idea or not, because the internet is big enough that it only takes one person to go and do it, and there's always going to be that one guy who's on a mission from God and is going to go do it, and that's in an age of cyber weaponry, the tools of war and of mass war potentially are in the hands of all of us, right? The fact, I mean, you here are on the front lines by virtue of being equipped, with weapons in your mind.
A question. A question over here or a comment over there?
Do you think, am I on? Yep. Do you think the public perception is changing? I don't remember growing up seeing things about viruses on the news, but as soon as it started encrypting people's files and they had to pay money to get them back, people start taking notice.
Front page of the newspaper in Wellington, New Zealand in 1986 was about the stone virus taking out the Australian military in Canberra.
Okay, you're older than me.
I think the Michelangelo virus got a lot as well.
Such sick burns, sick burns.
A question or a comment over here?
So we talked about the public viewing viruses as like more or less a cold. Is there a way that we can change that public perception? Say everyone likes to go out and buy new cars. Can we start explaining that just good enough isn't good enough?
Car analogies, shit.
We know lots and lots and lots of ways that don't work. So we've spent at least 15 years exploring all the ways that don't work. we may eventually find one that does, but so far as I know, we haven't.
I mean, Dr. Peter here did a talk about security interface design for browsers, right, and all the ways that we've tried to explain the goddamn padlock to people for the last 20 years and how well that's worked out. And let's face it, the padlock's pretty simple, right? It's either a padlocky one or it's not a padlocky one, and that hasn't worked. How well has it worked, Dr. Peter Goodman?
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I think one of the problems is that for an awful lot of use cases across a huge range of things, just good enough is good enough. Okay, maybe not in security, definitely not in security, but when people vote with their dollars, and if you tell somebody we can build you a really secure, proven secure computing system that will have none of these problems, and it'll cost you even 5 times what you currently pay for them, is that a worthwhile trade? Most people will either not be in a position to simply do it at all, or they would choose to, the path of least resistance, which is I'll pay this, virus tax every 6 months or whatever, and come get someone to clean up my computer and move on and assume that nothing, earth-shatteringly bad will come out of it.
I mean, we've got a perfect example in the mobile world, right? The Android ecosystem is clearly the minimum viable phone, or smartphone, right? It works, does the job. It's terrible, you can't patch it because of the ecosystem, or you can pay twice as much, 3 times as much, buy yourself an Apple device which gets patches regularly, and by and large, modulo, people popping iOS O-Day regularly, is clearly a better ecosystem. But for most people, right, you go into the shop, you buy the $50 phone or the $800 phone. Most people, $50 phone's the right choice, right? Because they're not going to be hacked by people with crazy stage fright, lib stage fright bugs or something, until I guess everybody gets hacked by lib stage fright bugs. But yeah, it's a perfect example of that. But then again, on the other hand, a consumer who goes into a mobile carrier shop to buy an Android phone has zero information in which to, express their free market, hand on the basis of security. It's not a thing by which you choose your bank or your phone, because they're not metrics that are exposed to people. It's one of the reasons that SSL security, despite being, who's been hacked by SSL? Nobody, right? The fact that that is a thing we care about largely is an externally observable metric, right? If someone's got a rubbish cert on their website or they haven't tuned their cipher settings on their Apache, it tells us something about their security posture in general, but not with any specificity, because it doesn't actually matter because no one gets hacked by SSL. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is you don't make consumer choices on the basis of security because A, it's either not important, or B, we don't tell anybody anything about the security of their phone. If you told people, like if the $50, Alcatel Android phone had a warning label like a pack of cigarettes, actually no, that doesn't work either. People would just smoke the phone. So yeah.
to continue with like the biological side of things, like the analogies to like biological vulnerabilities, like okay, we know that you can wash your hands and you go get sick less. How many people have observed other people that don't wash their hands in a public bathroom, right? Maybe it's only the men's rooms that I see that happening. But I mean, the advances that have come there, like people still don't believe that vaccines are helpful. And in some cases, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Individual cases are always very interesting and unique. The point is, like, it's a psychological and a human problem that people are not adopting all these things that they could do to make themselves healthier, right? So when we look at it for our digital devices and our systems and servers and computer viruses and attacks and hackers and all that stuff, it's the same thing. Like we can come up with technical solutions and that's going to help, but people are still going to not understand it, even with all this education, even with science and data and everything else that we've got.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just, the inherent complexity of the modern world. In the same way that any sufficiently advanced technology is effectively indistinguishable from magic, any sort of sufficiently plausible marketing claim is indistinguishable from bullshit. And so on what basis do you make an assessment whether phone A, B, or C actually truly represents the claims of the manufacturer, unless you have the ability to, either virtually or physically open it up and validate those claims, or you have other trusted authorities who have done that for you, you're just literally taking it on trust from the people who want to part you from your money.
And I think we are starting to see some approach, where there is testing. I mean, the US Federal Trade Commission, for example, has really started to move against Internet of Things rubbish manufacturers, webcam vendors and that kind of thing, who've had their stuff owned. And I mean, some of them, I think, was it D-Link? Link, I can't remember which one, TP-Link maybe, that have like a 20-year injunction against them by the FTC where they have to submit like, what is it, every couple of years, an audit report that explains why they're not going to get owned this week to the FTC for the next 20 years, right? Which in terms of internet stuff, they wouldn't exist in 20 years if they're out of business or being bought by Broadcom or Intel or whoever. And so we are starting to see like just, I mean, IoT things, I guess, is a place where the devices and the services and the software are A, bundled together into a complete unit, and B, small and discrete enough that you can kind of consume, you know, a general consumer rating, like this one cares about your privacy this little, and this one cares this little. You know, you can make some informed choices about your $60 webcam. No one's going to make an informed choice about a $60 webcam. They're just going to buy it.
Can we just take a question from George? He's been waiting for a little while.
Sorry about your hand.
Hi.
I'm getting sore.
Yeah, sorry, TMZ print edition. Just a question on something which is obviously an emerging future technology, but it's here and available for us today, which is the blockchain. Surprising, we haven't debated it enough. But sort of sifting science fiction from science fact, what do you see as a realistic future for blockchain tech, perhaps contextually in Australia, maybe in terms of the segments that you're involved in, and what do you think we'll see in terms of those developments over the next couple of years?
So the blockchain is illegal because it contains child pornography in the case of the Bitcoin blockchain. So yes, no one used Bitcoin because it's illegal.
I think the future of the blockchain is that...
Metal, can you just explain that, sorry, because it's a really interesting actual technical story about what you're talking about. So did you just want to discuss what people have put in the blockchain, and it is actually there today?
So yeah, obviously blockchain is an immutable storage mechanism for storing, you know, incrementing bits of data, and there are ASCII art pictures of Silvio, and... Well, there are, right? There's pretty sure. Isn't there an ASCII art picture of Silvio in there? I'm pretty sure there is. If there isn't, there will be by the end of this, you know. If someone wants to take the like $40 worth of transaction fees to stick an ASCII art picture of Silvio in there, then I've got it right here in my wallet. It's all good. You can store arbitrary data in the blockchain as part of its purpose. And yes, of course, people have done everything that you would imagine. Store Goatsy in it, store child pornography in it, store pictures of Silvio in it very soon. And yeah, by possession of child pornography is a crime. In hopefully every jurisdiction, it better will.
But does this represent a really a significant problem for those types of technologies that you can put arbitrary data? Like, how do you prevent that?
It's a good question. I guess make it expensive. I don't know. I mean,
back it by a bank.
We have jumped the shark so far with this whole blockchain thing that I'm still legit trying to figure out if that was like a serious or a troll question.
I'm with you on that one.
Oh yeah, good point. Maybe we did get trolled. God damn it, I bit the troll, didn't I?
Well, I was going to point out that, you know, the purpose of or what's going to be done with the blockchain, it will be used to drive monorails, faster than light transport and space elevators.
I think now's a good time for a topic change, actually.
Yeah, Satoshi just doesn't want the truth there. Yeah.
So Australia has just recently brought into effect mandatory data breach notification laws. They've come into effect this year. Ultimately, how do you guys think it will affect us? Do you think it's going to work? Does it work overseas? Maybe Jess, you can answer this one.
Yeah, I guess I'm the obvious choice for some of this. I think the short answer is that we can actually see already that it is working to an extent, and I think things are going to have to settle down over time. The OAIC, which is the government body that administers this scheme, received 63 breach notifications in the first 6 weeks of the scheme, and they've produced a quarterly report based around that. And that compares to 114 notifications for all of the previous financial year when that was a voluntary disclosure situation. There's some interesting things around that. The requirement to report the breach is it's up to the organisation itself to determine whether it's actually a significant risk of harm to the affected individuals for that breach. So there's no kind of hard and fast, which is a good thing in many ways. You know, most of our governance around this kind of stuff is risk-based rather than compliance-based and checkbox-based.
Is there some regulations that an annual turnover of $3 million for commercial companies?
Yeah, so it applies. So they talk about what they call APP entities, and APP is the Australian Privacy Principles, which is laid out in the Privacy Act 1988, which is the federal legislation. All of the states and territories have their own version of that as well, that they need to be compliant with as well. And so APP entities, and look, I'm not a lawyer, but this is from my exposure to it and my understanding of it, includes most federal government agencies. It excludes most state and territory governments, and it includes private sector and not-for-profits where their turnover is greater than 3 million, as you said. So I think the issue there is a threshold that means that small businesses don't have enormous compliance burdens around this sort of thing. But it's, you know, I personally think it's a good approach. I don't know about how much fine-tuning or tweaking is going to need to go, and I think that's a matter of, you know, my preference would be you put it out there, you get some data, you iterate on that, and you see where you end up. But, you know, depending on which country you're in and which sort of political persuasion or end of the political spectrum you kind of sit in, people may think that regulation is a great thing or a terrible thing or, you know, an indifferent thing. But in many industries we've seen many times that if you allow industries whose primary motivation is profit to self-regulate, they tend to not always do an awesome job of it. And sometimes they only start really giving good consideration to it when there's serious threat of regulation brought in or actual regulation. It's the same as, you know, people talking about various sorts of things. Well, if we're all adults, we can just behave. Why do we need, you know, whatever it is, code of conduct or something? It's like, well, yeah, but if we're all nice people, then why do we need laws and why do we need jails? It's like, let's just all be nice to each other. Again, I say, have you met people? That's just not viable. And so I personally think a degree of regulation is good. It means, if nothing else, organisations have to seriously start considering, and there will be some organisations who maybe choose not to disclose, but at the very least it means that their calculus has to include what is my potential penalty if I choose not to disclose versus if I do disclose, and if I'm subsequently found out if I don't disclose, rather than just do we think we can get away with not telling anybody.
I did notice something very interesting. It said that in addition to government agencies and departments and so forth and $3 million turnovers, that tax file number recipients would also be obligated under the mandatory data breach notification laws to disclose that. And that includes things like tax agents and accountants. And if you know, in my experience anyway, your average tax agent, you know, maybe he's got 2 or 3 people at his company. You know, he's not exactly, or he or she is not, you know, has a great security posture. They're just a small business, well under that $3 million turnover rate, and they're going to be required for mandatory data breach notifications. Do we see this as we're going to have a huge surge of tax agents that are disclosing breaches? You know, does it happen? Do tax agents get attacked? You know, Liam and Metal, you've done a lot of pen testing. Do you pen test tax agents, accountants, people that receive tax file numbers?
Who's going to inform all those small businesses that they've been breached?
That's a good point.
So you know who's really not a big fan of mandatory breach disclosures, to the extent that they put in a special exemption in the legislation that we didn't mention, is political parties are explicitly exempt from this legislation, which is fantastic for them, isn't it?
We'll take a question or a comment over here.
In regards to the exceptions of the Privacy Act, talking about the tax file number recipients, I think it's pretty interesting to consider the fact that pretty much all businesses, regardless of annual turnover, are going to be recipients of tax file numbers because of their employees and their payroll. So if those organisations are breached, they will have to notify their own employees that their personal information has been breached.
So I think one of the considerations, and I guess I can't really speak to the intention of the OAIC in adding that exemption, but to my way of thinking, you know, when we're doing risk assessment on, you know, from a security perspective on ICT systems, things like that, one of the things we consider is not just, say, the classification or sensitivity of the data, the value of the data, but also in aggregate, that it changes the risk profile of that. So if you're a company that employs 10 people and yes, you do have their tax file numbers, that's one kind of risk. It's not the same thing as if you are a tax agent and you maybe have 10,000 or 5,000. The scale of that means that it's kind of a different risk calculus around it. So I think that's actually maybe a reasonable approach to it, where you can say, okay, companies below $3 million probably don't have that many people on staff. They maybe should be, I mean, you know, this is the minimum compliance standard. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to report things that don't meet the threshold if you think it's important to do. So you can choose to do that. And in fact, from that perspective, you know, ACT government under this scheme is actually not considered an APP entity, but we're in the process because, and you know, one of my hobby horses is about trusting government and those kind of things. And I think I'm really pleased to see us having done this, is that from a policy perspective, there's a draft policy that's being put together and circulated that is going to, you know, the intention is that it will state our position that we will behave as though we were an APP entity, even though we're not technically required to under the legislation. And look, as territory and state legislation catches up with some of these new introductions, I would expect maybe they might, you know, mirror some of these provisions in their own legislation as well, that then makes it explicit. And I think that's a good thing, because I think, you know, one of the key success things in delivery of government services is, you know, is there trust by the citizens in the government? And that's really along two axes. That's, do they trust our capability to keep their data secure in the first place? Do they actually think we can do it? And secondly is, do they trust that the purpose for which we're using the data is what we've said, and are we going to creep the scope in some way? Now, we're not allowed to under the Privacy Act, and nor are other organisations, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been done or that there are not concerns around that. So, you know, for me, I think, you know, I would encourage anyone who is not sure, am I technically obliged to report this breach? You know, maybe err on the side of being a good corporate citizen and doing that, rather than just kind of skating away with what you can get away with.
We have a question or a comment over here.
So we've touched on anticipated effects of this new legislation a little already, and I guess because it is so recent, you know, it's going to take some time before we can actually measure outcomes. But I guess I'm wondering what the wider panel thinks maybe about the likelihood that this is going to result in, you would call it, improved behaviour in terms of businesses and things. Because as we've discussed, like, you can give users information about, okay, this company has had a breach, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have the context to decide, oh, I'm going to go with a competitor now. In the case of something like Equifax in the US, they don't have the option of selecting a competitor anyway. So yeah, two parts. Sort of, is the idea that now that there is mandatory disclosure, there is more, like, an increased avenue for OAIC to deliver enforcement? Because I mean, the Privacy Act does require you to take reasonable measures. But also, do we think that just having to admit you got owned and then get ridiculed on Twitter for a bit is going to result in improvements, or is, like, people are still going to spam the "I accept the risk" button?
Well, so we've actually got some data on this quite recently from the Facebook scandal, where within the last couple of days, some organisation reported that something like 10% of users in the US, I don't know how accurate this is, but 10% of Facebook users have closed their accounts. So you don't necessarily need enforcement, you just need some way to let people know this thing that you're doing. In the case of Facebook, you know, I guess everyone in the room knows that putting lots of private stuff on Facebook isn't a good idea. The general public probably had some vague inkling but didn't know how bad it was. Now that they've had this breach disclosure of notification via the media, people are actually realising this is a really bad thing and closing their accounts. So there is at least some evidence in that disclosure notification does work, although possibly not, you know, in the way that maybe the Australian government intended when they passed the legislation.
Although we don't know if that 10% of users was just the Russian troll farm.
Exactly, yeah. That's the thing, is we don't know how accurate that data is.
Actual humans. I mean, we certainly have seen examples overseas where the breach notifications have just kind of, you know, people get bored once you've lost your private data 3 times. It's kind of not private the 4th time. The incremental cost of having a breach of your data reported to you, you know, is essentially 0 after you've lost your birth date or your face or your biometrics or whatever else.
And who doesn't want an extra 3 years of credit monitoring, right?
And who doesn't want free credit monitoring? I know I do, right? I'd love to monitor some credits. But yeah, no, we certainly have seen that kind of breach notification fatigue. I mean, how many of you have been to, have I been pwned and looked up your stuff to see how much of your email accounts have been, yeah. How many have done it more than once? Twice, 3 times, 4 times? Who does it like every week? Oh, you subscribe, I guess, I suppose.
I look up all sorts of people on that.
Sorry?
Do you mean not everybody has like standing searches for text strings on pastebin? Is this not standard operating procedure?
Pretty sure it is in this room, but in the wider audience, probably not. Probably not. But yeah, I don't know whether it's an effective thing. Although the thing that occurred to me, listening to this conversation, not being super familiar with the Australian legislation, is there a penalty for reporting a breach that didn't happen? Like, as you said, like, err on the side of responsibility, right? If you're not sure, maybe report it anyway, but...
As far as I'm aware, I don't think there is.
Right, so it seems like the end...
So what you're suggesting there might be some kind of denial of service attack on the OAIC's capability
No,
to treat breaches
I'm just
or
saying
something.
that as a hacker, I see you get a fine for not reporting a breach that did happen, and you don't get a fine for reporting a breach that didn't happen. Well, it seems like you should just set up a cron job to report a breach every day, right? Thus covering you for the breaches you don't know about, right? And then you're never going to get fined, right? It seems like an engineering solution.
Now,
it's just hacking.
Clearly, I like the way you think, but having said that, I mean, the fine is not the only outcome. Obviously, reputational damage is the other side of this coin, is that the fact that the OAIC will be having transparent reports around the people who did breach, and we can also get a handle on which sectors maybe are more at risk or more trash fire than others, is that you're not just, most large organisations are not really super worried about any kind of fine that such a regulatory body may impose on them. They're more worried about being dragged through the court of public opinion and losing potential customers.
But then when the report comes out, right, and there's a graph that says, here are all the breaches that happened, and here's this one company that reported 365 breaches, one for every day of the year, right? Marketing visibility, like mindshare, straight to the top, like top right of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for that guy.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think if maybe that's one response. The other response is, really, you're still reporting a breach every day and you still haven't patched your stuff after all this time? I mean, come on.
We'll take a question or a comment over here.
As a young person and sort of university student myself, I've noticed that a lot of young people seem to have given up on the idea of privacy and the idea that they can put something on the internet and it will remain private, especially thinking back to things like Snapchat, Yahoo, and more recently Facebook, and the idea that their information is effectively being used for profit anyway. So I know a lot of young people I talk to who aren't technically inclined. You tell them things like, don't use the same password for everything, and they say, oh, why does it matter? I've been hacked 100 times anyway. The NSA is watching me through my webcam. Why should I care? Do you think we'll actually get to a point where that sort of, that thinking becomes more pervasive, and to a certain extent, privacy just loses its value in general because data is not private by default?
I think that's an absolutely valid conclusion to draw from if you're a young person growing up in the current state of things. And I'm, as an old man, I'm really sorry that we did that to you. Right? We did that. We built this system that you grew up in and has now taken away your privacy. When I was your age, right, I wrote all my dumb shit on a BBS, which is long gone. Right? There's no record of that on the internet. No one's got FeederNet archives. It's great, right? Okay, maybe. Okay, let's not talk about FeederNet archives. But that stuff died, right? And it gave us a chance to make mistakes on the internet, to learn the trade of hacking, and to not really pay the price for that. That unfortunately now we as a young person trying to get a job, every dumb thing you've ever posted a picture of on Facebook or whatever. Probably don't use Facebook because you're a young person and it's only for old people. But yeah, I mean that's a really shitty situation, right, that you guys are in, and I'm real sorry about that. I don't know what you're going to do about it, but we'll get to a point, I guess, when you've matriculated into being an old man like me, where maybe we will have paid the full cost of that, and much like we're paying the full cost of fossil fuels now, or at least beginning to think about it, we'll start to pay the full cost of giving away privacy and pretending it doesn't matter anymore when it absolutely does. And all of the 90s cypherpunks who are crying into their OpenBSD installs will have been replaced by people who have new and fresh ideas about how we're going to do this.
We'll take a question and a comment on this side.
Yes?
Yes.
Hello, great. I know that I sometimes use notifications from Have I Been Pwned to say, you have an account on this very old website. Did you remember that you had it? maybe you should delete it now. How do you, as people who are pretty good at internet, I assume, how do you act as a custodian of your information on the internet? Do you keep track of the accounts that you have? Do you occasionally go through like your key storage solution and delete old accounts?
It sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah,
I think yeah, definitely best practice. Yes. I don't know, like the guy who what's the guy who makes the shoes called? Whose kids always have rubber shoes? He's the cobbler. Is that what he is? Like a pie?
so, yeah.
I don't know. Pie. That's sidetrack. Sorry. Yes, cobblers have terrible shoes. That's the plumbers' toilets are not great. Those toilets are fantastic, though, Silvio. You spent your money well.
And there's like there are a whole bunch of tools that are great for managing that sort of stuff now that I guess didn't exist 15 years ago when I was creating these dumb accounts that I wish didn't exist. So in a lot of ways, people registering accounts now sort of do have a lot more options in terms of managing that. But yeah, we're probably the worst people to ask about it because I'm sure we have like horrible logs on the internet that don't look for them.
I registered a domain that I tried to get for like a decade before the person who had it gave it up. And it's joefitz.com because, you know, I'm Joe Fitz. And I've been interested in all the emails I get to that domain to this day. I know a lot about this person, a lot more than I ever wanted to know about another person. And their tastes and their opinions and their thoughts and the websites they registered to, and it's pretty interesting.
What I just heard was amazing plausible deniability that any of that stuff is actually yours.
I don't know what you're talking about.
We'll just take a comment or a question over here.
Going back to what you were saying earlier about, you know, the idea of privacy being dead, on the flip side of that, and perhaps naively optimistically, what do you think of Cory Doctorow's idea of this being the period of peak indifference, where we've hit a point where everybody doesn't care enough, and this is the point where, after this point, more people will begin to care than didn't care?
So on that topic, like, I don't necessarily buy this narrative that like young people don't care about privacy. I think people like Mark Zuckerberg like love that narrative. I think they care about privacy in different ways to the older generation. Like if you have taken a photo and put it on Facebook or on Snapchat, then you're accepting that, yeah, this is probably going to end up being seen by other people on Facebook or Snapchat. There's a chance it might get you know, hacked. That this is a risk that I am managing in my life because I choose to participate in these services. But it's still something that you've consented to play the game. So there's a lot to privacy where you're, you know, if I've taken photos that I didn't put on the internet, or you know, if I put on what I thought was a private service and got hacked, that is still, I think, felt as a massive breach of privacy. And you know, I could be wrong. Obviously, I'm not a young person anymore. But that's, yeah, I really don't buy into that whole like privacy is dead narrative. I think that's bullshit.
Can we take a question or a comment? Over on the side.
Yep. Given that the quarterly report, or you mentioned that 60-something signed up for this straight away, but really the most recent data breach was Facebook, and that only resulted in about 10% of people deleting their accounts. How do you easily convey that information, even though it's going to be in a quarterly report, in a way that like people can easily see, akin to like the health star rating or how much water you use with every flush on your toilet?
I think there's a risk of oversimplifying data, which is, you know, we need to strike a balance between that. I think one of the critical things in all of this is, you know, as we talk about you know, a free and open press is a great thing to have. You know, they can play that game of taking the detailed report, and in fact, you know, most people will not have read the detailed report that the OAIC released. They will have read a news article on it somewhere, or seen a 30-second grab on a TV show or something like that. So, I mean, I think, I'm not sure that's a new problem that we need to solve. That's really the ongoing issue of how do we take complex data and represent it in ways that are meaningful and impactful to people who don't have expertise, and how do we ensure that the people who are doing that are not skewing their, through their own biases, and we all talk, if you have that kind of skeptical approach, you talk about not wanting to accept arguments from authority, but the truth is that most of us make that as part of our calculation in where we get our news sources, how reliable we think it is, and those are kind of the critical skills that people either have or need to have to kind of navigate a very complex social environment because of the scale that we're at now.
Take a question on this side.
So we've touched on a bunch of things where we've built this complex system, and whenever we build a complex system, we lose a lot of the resiliency in it. With the data breach notification laws being vague on some of the terms of it, you've got the chance that for the example of the TFNs that companies might have internally, I can see some of them probably taking a path where they say, we don't have the data to know that a breach happened, therefore maybe we don't have to disclose.
No logs, no crime.
And so then we've also got, in terms of how things get reported, who is broken, and abuse contacts are really hard for the internet. For what we were talking about before on the sort of code blue idea, I think you're going to have a hard time saying that you haven't violated something that sounds like the Computer Misuse Act if you're going around patching unilaterally. But on the other hand, you've got a middle ground where outfits like Shadow Server are probably reporting to a quarter of the people in this room that they've got a poodle vulnerability. It's more of a grey area if it ever ends up being a discussion how you fingerprint whether someone's vulnerable, right? Because some of the tests for these things actually cross into, let's say, reading memory in the case of some of the more interesting exploits that have been out there versus just fingerprinting version strings or whatever else. But all this resiliency is going to be lost in the common stories. But our abuse mechanisms are broken. The way people would report that a company that's a third party might have suffered a breach might be to their line one that doesn't know how to recognize it and doesn't know what they're doing. This whole thing is pretty broken, but can we push off some of the abuse to maybe the people responsible for getting them on the internet, so actually the resellers of IP space and ISPs?
There was so many parts to that question that I'm afraid you overflowed a buffer in my head. And, someone else?
Look, I think it's a cogent description of a great many problems that we have, and if they were easy answers that we could give glibly on a panel, then we totally would, but yeah, not.
Look, we're running out of time, so we'll take one more question and then we'll cross over for you guys to close up with your thoughts.
Hey, Silvio, I've got a question. Am I allowed to have a question? Actually, it's not really a question, I just wanted to talk some more. Lily, returning to your peak and difference thing, I was thinking about it whilst the other question was happening. Sorry. And I don't know how many of you have followed the situation of privacy in China over the years, and this kind of concept of a social credit score where, like, if you get drunk and spit on the bus, then you're no longer allowed to ride a bus anywhere in the country because they can data match you and they know that you're a bad citizen. And you have this kind of, like you have financial credit scores in the US, in China you have this kind of social credit score, which combined with pervasive facial recognition, like automatic facial recognition, number plate recognition, all the ways of tracking where people are, what they're doing, integrated monitoring of communications in and out of the country, right? You think we're at peak and difference? Can you imagine what it's like in China, right? And you only have to look, like we are in, let's face it, the liberal West, right, where if we think it's bad here, I mean, how many of you have been to China and tried to operate your regular Western internet life behind the Great Firewall of China, right? That's a pretty eye-opening experience, right? You realize actually what blue coat proxies are capable of. It turns out quite a lot of SSL intercept, eh? Like, I guess some people do get hacked by SSL after all. But yeah, like, we are so far from peak and difference, right? If we get to the point where that kind of thing's happening here, like, then we're going to see some, like, wow, privacy is totally dead. So whilst everything we have is terrifying and it's all super depressing, like, you look at how much worse it's going to get unless we figure out some reasonable balance between, even just facial recognition as a tech everywhere, plus data matching is terrifying. And you see how they're using it, and yeah, wow. So, you know, cypherpunks are going to have to rise again, patch their BSD, and, you know, yeah.
I think we've seen this movie, and it was Gattaca in one sense. But I think the interesting thing around that too is that large-scale systems can have unintended consequences, and so we might actually end up in an evolutionary arms race where everyone ends up with amazing OPSEC because they kind of have to.
Everyone has to wear like dazzle cam makeup.
Well,
and, yeah.
or everyone has, you know, because of this, you know, nation-state installed panopticon in people's heads, they present, you know, a public face in real life as well as just the online world, which of course is real life anyway. And then everything else is kept internal and secretive. You know, like if you've read 1984,
thought crime.
There's a lot of dissembling going on, and there's a lot of what you present to the world versus what you present to your intimates who you think you can trust. So.
You hope you can trust, and their Android phones that they're carrying around that you can't trust.
So and there's another comment on peak and difference is that, and again putting on my academic hat for a minute, I mean researchers have explored ways of communicating risk to users better. So currently we communicate risk really badly. Can we do it better? And the answer is yes, we can do that, but then users have no way of responding to that. All it does is it raises their level of anxiety. They look around, there's nothing they can actually do to deal with that, and eventually they sort of ignore it and keep moving on. So it's not so much that people don't care, it's that even if they do care, there's nothing they can do about it. If, you know, let's say you use an Android phone, okay, that means Google can know about pretty much anything you do that involves that phone. Unless you're a technical person and you run some custom hacked up version of Android that doesn't report back to Google, there is nothing that the average user can do about that. So it's not so much that people don't care, it's that maybe they do care, but there's nothing they can do about it.
I'm going to have to stop you guys there and continue that thought, but we'll just get a closing comment from each of our panelists, maybe starting with Joe. Close with some words and leave us with some ideas.
No pressure. It's got to be insightful.
Hack all the things.
Yes.
I know Faz had some sort of buzzword bingo competition where if you win, he has to give you free shit. So I'd just like to say artificial intelligence, machine learning, APT, Red Team, Stuxnet. Kill chain, threat hunting, cyber criminal, accepted risk, and base 64 encryption. Thank you.
At least we already got blockchain.
I don't have any amazingly wise words that I can, you know, put coherently in a few sentences. I'm often considered, I think, a cynic. I think there's a difference between sarcasm and cynicism. I kind of have hope in people, and I think actually what I see is a lot of people here who provide a lot of hope. Also a lot of terror, but, you know, a lot of hope as well. And sure, you know, the world is terrible and everything's on fire, but I see an amazing group of people who are perhaps, you know, our last best hope for architecting some of the future fire extinguishers that may help us navigate this wonderful, terrible mess.
Thank you. Let's thank Jess. Peter?
So Miguel mentioned earlier a car analogy for security. So here's an actual car analogy. The average person knows you get into a car, you turn the key to the right and the engine starts, you turn it to the left, the engine stops. They don't need to know how an internal combustion engine works or details of an engine management unit or a million other things. So why should users actually need to know all these low-level technical details about security and padlocks and viruses and all these other things when they don't need to know the same thing with cars? You know, what car manufacturers have managed to get it right, why can't computer people get it right?
I think probably because cars are relatively simple by comparison to global technical infrastructure. I don't know. I mean, I feel I guess the same way as Jess, except without the hope. I mean,
you may have 1 or 2 years on me, but not much more, I don't think.
No, I mean, I think it is clear from this conversation, and for those of you who listen to Risky Biz, I'm sure you will have heard the refrain that we live in the cyberpunk dystopia, and we totally are in just like the worst science fiction noir cyberpunk dystopian future, and you guys are the noodle-eating, cyber-implanted tip of the spear of that stuff. And if you want to stop us from ending up, did I fill in an extra one you missed?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet, good stuff. Cybersphere, what? Oh, Spear. If you guys want to help us not end up in wherever this worst timeline is heading, which it absolutely fucking is, then you are the ones that are equipped to make a difference in a way that almost no one else on the planet is, right? You've got the force multiplier of the cybers. Was that on there, force multiplier? Of the cybers? You are, I mean, you are individually one man, one person, one woman force multiplier right now, and you can go out and you can patch all of the Microtech routers on the planet tonight if you want, right? Grab Shimei Red off GitHub, go own all of the little Microtech devices, and you could have yourself a 100,000 node botnet, this evening. Well, obviously you have to fight off everybody else who's doing the same thing, but you can, right? You can go out right now and you can do that, and you can do your bit to try and turn this into the least, slightly less worse timeline. On the other hand, you could sell out, get a job, work in the mill industrial complex, make some cluster bombs, blow up some babies, whatever else. Oh, it's Canberra, I probably can't say that here, eh? I don't know. It's a shitty timeline we live in, and welcome to the cyberpunk future. I hope you got your mirror shades, eh? Because we're so here.
Thanks, Mendel. And one more round of applause for all of our panelists. We have now our closing awards and ceremony, so we'll set up and we'll kick off in a few minutes.